So the first question, and I want to preface this that I'm actually looking at the questions for the first time tonight. The first topic is the economy, taxes, and inequality. Washington State has one of the fastest growing economies in the country. Yet far too many people are not sharing in that economic growth. Income inequality is in Washington is growing rapidly. Today, the wealthiest 1% of Washingtonians rake in about 25% more than the other 99%. Since the Great Recession, the top 1% in Washington State have taken all of the economic gains. To compound matters, according to the Institute of Taxation and Economic Policy's Tax Inequality Index, Washington has the most unfair tax and local tax system in the country. So we already have very high levels of inequality that have only gotten worse since the Great Recession. And we have a tax system that exacerbates the issue and makes inequality even worse. Widely shared prosperity happens when we deliberately invest in the foundations of a strong economy, broad and equal opportunity to build knowledge and skills, adequate compensation and support for workers, and adequate investments in conditions that foster economic growth. Please describe your plan to address our broken tax system, enhance access to quality education, reverse the trend toward greater inequality, and tell us what other investments you would propose to foster broadly shared economic growth. Does anybody have a quarter? Yes. So, which one wants to go first? We're just going to toss all of it in. Must be that single details. So Joe will take the question first, and Stephen is our timer, and you'll see the screen there, and I urge you to please, as best we can, stay with the stated time on the screen for your response.
First off, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here to speak. I think the attendance is a little bit higher than it is normally, so wonderful to have everybody out on this beautiful day in West Seattle. This is obviously a very, very big issue. One of the core principles that we have in terms of running for office in the first place is, like Chris mentioned, Washington is one of the wealthiest states in the wealthiest nation in the world. There is no reason why anybody here in the United States and Washington State and Seattle should be too poor to live, period. So using that as a guiding principle, that informs a lot of the issues that we care about and how we would craft legislation as well. So in terms of our broken tax system, which is one of the key issues that we face, despite having a robust economy, not everybody gets to share in that. There's actually a New York Times article that states that working families are seeing very little, if any, gains in terms of wages when it comes to the share and the growth of this economy. One of the biggest things, first off, let's just start with the broken tax system. It's obviously regressive. Right now, folks that make under $25,000 pay about 17% of their income in taxes. Folks that make over $500,000 pay about 2%. That's obviously not fair. The problem is we only have a few different mechanisms to pay for revenue for our budget. So property taxes, sales taxes, some DNA, and some fees as well. Limiting it to those three will keep it regressive. So we need to address that in the first place. The first thing we can do that is on the table right now is a capital gains tax to ensure that we're charging for funds that is more progressive. There's also about 684 tax exemptions, might be even more than that now, on the books that don't sunset. If you add up the value of these tax exemptions, they actually add up to more than the budget itself. The interesting about these tax exemptions for corporations is that they don't expire, or the majority of them, I think 99% of them, do not expire. So in times where we actually have a need to fully fund our budget, like during a recession, these tax exemptions are actually exempt. And what's even worse is that a lot of these tax exemptions, in fact, have provisions where you can't even do an analysis on how much is being saved. So we don't actually know the true cost of how much this is being given up for our state. Another part of our broken tax system as well is, honestly, we can have a state bank that will then harvest about $2.3 billion of interest that goes to Wall Street right now that we can then reinvest in our economy and our nation as well. So that is obviously a big deal. One of the things that we need to do as elected officials is making sure that we are also accountable for the money being spent and that we have trust in the public to be able to use that appropriately. I think once we are able to earn that trust, it'll be a lot easier to talk about income tax for a whole host of people. I personally support it already, but I think the folks that are on the fence, it's because they don't know that they can trust their elected officials in order to use that money wisely. So those are some of the few ways that I would go about addressing our broken taxation system. That's obviously a very long conversation that we can have as well. On the education side, obviously we're experiencing right now what happens when you have an inequitable solution for funding education. The McCleary Act, what it does was actually address the law student, not necessarily address the opportunity gap for our education system. So specifically, if you look at it from a regional approach, Vashon actually got a lower amount in terms of their increase versus regionally other folks in the area as well, HEA and SEA. So we need to make sure that we support our teachers and our education system with the appropriate funding so that we can actually close the achievement gap. What that means to me is that we need to have funding for teachers so they can have a livable wage, condense the schedule for which their salary is paid, make it easier for them to have, say, loan forgiveness programs. My wife, so today, was the first day back at school for my daughter, who was 3 and a half, also for my wife. So she just went back to Shorewood Elementary. So she's been in the Highland Public Schools for about 10 years as a special education teacher. So education for me is important because I grew up in the Highland Public School District. My wife is an educator in the Highland School District for about 10 years. And we see firsthand what happens when it's not fully funded. We need to make sure that our teachers are supported, which makes sure that our students themselves are supported as well. When it comes to inequality, I only have about a minute left, so what I'm going to talk about first is higher arching is making sure that representation exists in our society. So one way for us to fix a broken system to ensure that everybody gets access is making sure that our leadership represents the values of the community. So for instance, if you look at the way that the budget is structured in Washington State, every single line item has a champion behind it. So what that means is, if you have representatives who don't necessarily reflect the community, it isn't as if they don't care about us or working class families or people of color. It's that they're so far removed from our lived experiences that they might not necessarily know what that actually entails. So the thing for us is we need to support one another in our community to make sure that we have representation that reflects everybody in this district. We need to have a progressive tax structure that supports all people, working class families. We need to make sure that we're fighting for working class families, for strong unions, for minimum wage, for the right to organize, and supporting our public educators as well. Healthcare, that is one of the sources for inequities in terms of having to choose between healthcare or bankruptcy. As a person who works with, sorry, I'm kind of deviating a little bit because the timing is going down. As a person that works a lot with family homelessness, early learning is actually very important as well. Early learning and childcare is right when it starts in terms of when the inequities start to happen as well. In 2 seconds, thank you.
Shannon, you'll get 3 minutes to cross-examine his content.
All right, great. I think, as we know, I would imagine most people in this room, I hope, support a capital gains tax as a way to address our regressive tax system, as do I. And in interviews, I've heard you describe it as the way you would try to pass it in the legislature would be to name and shame your colleagues to get the capital gains tax passed. And I'm just curious to know what that looks like, how you would see that being successful to the legislature.
1 second. You will get your rebuttal.
Oh, sorry.
And you still have 2 minutes and 33 seconds. And then,
question?
Yes. So.
Do I have to take it, or can I?
So then, if you're going to end your time, then you get to now respond to the question.
Well, another question I would have is, do you have specific corporate tax breaks that you would be addressing as far as the public benefit?
So now you have 7 minutes to address the question at hand.
When I go before he rebuts.
Yes.
Oh,
how's he going to remember that?
I was not
Because he should write it down.
Yeah, I was not on debate team in college, believe it or not. Okay, Okay, well, thank you so much, everybody, for being here tonight. As always, it is wonderful to see community turn out and engage in this public process. And I think civic engagement is one of the most important things we can do, especially in this time we're living in and the things we're seeing at the federal level. So, interestingly enough, this evening my son had to interview me for a school project, and he was talking about, how did you end up in Seattle? And then the end of that story was about what are some of your hopes and dreams. And I realized one of my hopes and dreams was that my 3 children would have an opportunity to also live in Seattle should they be so inclined. And I think what we're seeing, based on the issues of the incredibly high cost of living, housing affordability generally, those opportunities are becoming more and more limited. They are indeed limited because, in part because of our unbelievably regressive tax system. We have got to address it. A few steps that I would very specifically take are to close some corporate tax breaks. There are indeed over 600 of them. The Washington Budget and Policy Center has done some great work in analyzing those. They recommend about 21 that they think could be closed. And I would highlight and focus on 5 of those really that I'll call out. One is luxury services, consumer services, international banking, prescription drug resellers, investment banking, and the tax break that people get from out of state if they're from a no sales tax state, because studies have shown that most of that happens in King County. We're not a border state that was intended to actually not adversely affect stores that are near the border of Oregon, right? And so, since that is not actually coming into play by the data, I think we should absolutely, specifically look at some of those tax breaks. I also think another step we should really take to regret, and that and a capital gains tax, by the way, on the top 2% of the population, those tax breaks, closing those tax breaks, addressing capital gains, could get us over $1 billion. So it's real money that we can actually do some real things with. One of the things I think we should absolutely discuss in the Senate is the working families tax rebate. It's something that was passed in 2008, but it was during the recession and it's never been funded. It's based on the earned income tax credit at the federal level, so it gives lower income families an opportunity to receive a debate based on their income, and it is a way to level the playing field when it comes to a sales tax. And finally, I think when we implement a capital gains tax, that we should also use it to provide some tax relief, and not just by raiding the rainy day fund, as we did to try to fund McCleary, but actually by providing a consistent source and ability to provide some relief. Obviously, it's complex issues. I know the progressive Democrats want to fight for this in the Senate. I want to fight for this in the Senate. And let me be clear, I'm somebody who supports an income tax. But I also know we are in a state where it's a big lift. And so I do think by demonstrating some of these smaller steps, how we can balance out the system a bit, building that trust and accountability with the taxpayers, we can get closer to a real income tax, and that's what I really want to see in this state. The next piece was related to education access, and I think it's unbelievably clear that whatever we're paying our teachers, we're clearly asking too much of them. Things have changed. My grandpa was a teacher in a small school in Eastern Washington. He was also the principal, he was also the basketball coach. He did everything, right? But I think that he was not dealing with nearly the number of challenges, the number of homeless students that we have in our schools, the number of kids that are living below the poverty line, the number of kids that have faced early childhood trauma. So we need to also invest in support services in our schools, nurses, counselors. We have got to make sure we are paying our teachers a salary that can help us recruit teachers. We want people to want to be in the profession. A woman I doorbelled the other day used to be a teacher. Now she's a nanny and she's going into nursing. This is clearly someone who wants to nurture and care for people, but teaching was not enough for her given the way we pay and the expectations that we have for our teachers. So we absolutely have to address again, a more consistent revenue source and genuinely make it a priority and a paramount duty. Finally, when we talk about job creation, again, all of these things blend together. How we manage our tax system, how we address affordability issues, how we are educating. I am a proponent of having people have the ability to have free community or technical college education. I think anybody who wants to step out of high school, go into a trade, we need to provide incentives for that. So maybe we can't get universal access to that right off the bat, but boy, we need to work harder on incentives. We need to work harder at introducing people to apprenticeships. I particularly want to see more women entering trades field. These are working, family, living wage jobs, and the state needs to do everything we can to support those. It's also a huge equity and social justice issue. It provides many more opportunities for kids and families who may not right away or ever be interested in going on a traditional four-year college path. It is not for everyone. And so I want to see us open up those opportunities more. And of course, as many of you have heard me talk about childcare access. I think, I've talked to women who have received grants to be able to go to community college, yet then they can't follow through on it because they can't find childcare for their young children while they're in class. Then they have inconsistent attendance, and then they don't do as well as they might otherwise do. We need to build an entire system to help support that work. And finally, at the state level, at the county, we have implemented an equity and social justice impact tool to review all of our legislation so that we do our best work, and there's always room for improvement, but that we do our best work to bring an equity and social justice lens to every policy we pass. The state needs to do the same kind of work. There are things happening there, there have been some introduction of some legislation, but I want to see it more widespread. I want to see us work harder and smarter and more effectively to bring together all of our communities so that we have equal access to opportunities so that all of us can thrive. That's what compels me to run. That's why I get excited about this kind of work. Good policy like that and prioritization like that matters. So thank you so much.
3 minutes to cross-examine her response. And then you get a chance to rebut what she put. Yes.
Okay.
Were you not on TV either?
That's warmer than this. In terms of the equity and access, I would really love to hear more about how you would work with communities of color and communities that have been historically marginalized in terms of making sure that they're included in the process as well. Housing and affordability are important things in terms of equity and access, so curious to see what your stances are on funding for that, and also how you would fight for and be a champion for more access to affordable housing. And then, I know this deviates too much, but homelessness obviously is an issue, so kind of along those lines at the same time as well.
And you have 4 minutes for the rebuttal that you were thinking about. Yes.
Perfect. Yeah, so just to make sure I'm correct, you're talking naming and shaming was one, and then the specific tax breaks that I would call out. So if we want to talk about the naming and shaming, if you read the stranger endorsement, I said more than just naming and shaming. I was very upset during that time. So let's be clear, the 34th is one of the most progressive districts, probably in the nation. We have the precinct that had the highest votes against Trump in the nation. So, yes, right? I'm proud of Trump for that. So, in my mind, naming and shaming is right. It's not my fault that Republicans are wrong. It's not my job to pander to Republicans. So, it's not my job, honestly, to pander to moderate Democrats. We are in a district that is very, very liberal. Our job here is to be bold, and our job here is to be unafraid. So let's just be clear what we're talking about when I'm talking about naming and shaming. Healthcare for all, progressive tax reform, fully funding education. These are the things that I care about, and these are the things that I think are important. We've knocked on over 15,000 doors. I've never had anybody say that those are bad ideas. None, right? So if somebody wants to tell me that they won't vote for access for healthcare to people, that it's okay that people should choose between bankruptcy and medical care, I don't give a fuck about them. Honestly, like, it is our job in this district to fight for every people in this community, period. So if that's what we want to talk about compromising on, I'm not doing it. We're going to make sure that we're fighting for our values in this district because of that. In terms of the action, sorry, I didn't mean to swear. I told myself that I was going to do it. Yeah, I'm sorry about that, Kate.
No swallow.
Yeah. My kids are asleep, so it's okay. In terms of the corporate tax breaks, one of the most important ones, part of the reasons why I get so frustrated by them is because we don't have clawback provisions, and we also don't have the ability to actually see how much is being spent on our exemptions. So I love Boeing. Boeing's fantastic, great company in Washington State. However, we gave them numerous tax exemptions to keep their manufacturing and their headquarters here in Seattle decades ago. What happened? They left for Chicago. So there are numerous tax exemptions that we gave them specifically to stay in Seattle, and they did not. I'd love to revisit those to make sure that they're being used appropriately and that we can actually fund those in a way that are more equitable as well.
You will have 6 minutes in your rebuttal, and this will be your final 6 minutes on this question.
Okay, I'm sorry though. Am I supposed to answer the questions you asked me first, or answer?
You have 6 minutes to do both.
To do whatever I will do. Okay, thank you very much. So first, I just want to say, based on that response, I do give a fuck. A big one. So, Dua Lipa has a great song, way to go. But this stuff matters. And it doesn't matter how mad we are about it if we don't effectively do something with that anger. I will do something effective with that anger. When it comes to equity access, I think that is one of the most important, some of the most important work that we are doing, and that we have not done for years. We have many policies based on very specific perspectives, and it's vital that we are moving forward and doing better work there. We have wonderful examples at King County, particularly, I know y'all have heard me brag a lot about our Best Starts for Kids levy, because that levy and that work has been remarkable. We're able to do pilot programs, we're able to test things, and some of the most important things we're doing is knowing and learning how to engage with community in better and more effective ways. I spent yesterday lunch hour with the Somali Health Board, where they were receiving a Resilient Community Award on behalf of public health, because members of the Somali community stepped up. They said, hey, public health, you're not engaging with us in a way that's working with our communities. We have some religious issues that are different than what you're used to, some other cultural issues that are different than what you're used to. We want you to help us do this work. We want to make your work better, right? And so in partnership, they worked together, and it was a great story because the imam of the mosque in Tukwila that was there, they talked about how he and the leadership at the mosque all got flu shots one day in front of the entire membership of the mosque so that they could demonstrate that vaccines aren't scary, right? They're okay, let's try it, because that was an issue within the Somali community. And the next year, yeah, it's fantastic, great work. The next year, they had more people showing up for vaccines. They had a similar instance with the mammogram mobile that they would bring to the community. The women would go in, they would look at it, didn't quite know what to think of it. There was education that happened, and then now we're able to be out there, women are getting their mammograms through the mobile unit. To me, that's a great example of really effective work with communities. It's not easy to do. Policymakers have to pay a lot of attention to that, constantly. Staff have to pay attention to it. We all have to be challenging ourselves, asking ourselves questions, being prepared to be uncomfortable about how much we don't know sometimes. I'm prepared to do that. I think that's really important work to bring. When it comes to funding for housing, because I'm getting to 3 minutes, I definitely think we need to raise the Housing Trust Fund to the $200 million level. The Housing Trust Fund was at about $200 million in 2008. It has not reached those levels since. It's about 130-ish now. We absolutely have got to increase that, because that money is used to leverage other dollars. It gives us more opportunities to partner with nonprofits, with municipalities, to make sure we are able to build more affordable housing. And when it comes to, I also wanted us to, at the state level, make sure we're continuing to look at surplus lands. They did great work last session to open up surplus lands so you don't have to sell them for fair market value. That used to be in legislation in the RCW. And now they've opened it up, but the Washington State Department of Transportation was not included in that. So I would like to also know an inventory of their properties, because frankly, if they're suitable for affordable housing and near transit locations, near resources, we should absolutely talk about those. That's work we need to continue to do. And then when it comes to homelessness, I want us to be, this is 2 minutes, okay. We've got to start addressing root causes more effectively, first of all. Homelessness is a very complex issue. Women most often become homeless because of domestic violence, right? Kids and families, if rent goes up by $100, there is a notable increase in homelessness, between 6 and 30% increase in homelessness. and then there are behavioral health and substance abuse issues. These are all very complex problems, and we need to start dealing with these things at the root. We need to prevent people from getting into homelessness in the first place. So providing more resources to frontline workers so that they can help families with flexible funding. The state started to do some of that work. I would want to build on that work. We've had great examples of the county of that work. I think that we also need to be certain that when we're building shelters for people in our homeless community, we need emergency shelters a little bit, but really what we need is 24/7 shelters. We need to invest in places where they can come and get resources, have a healthy place environment to be in, and also feel safe there. There are people who aren't willing to go to our shelters because they're worried their items will get stolen. They're worried they will be with a person who has been violent with them in the past. There are ways to address that issue, and 24/7 shelters that provide what a lot of people know as navigation centers as well are absolutely the most effective way. We need to have more opportunities to site those shelters and to make sure that we are treating the homeless in our community as the human beings that they are. We've got to meet people where they are. We've got to do everything in our power to prevent them from falling into homelessness in the first place.
Joe, you will have the final 3 minutes on this question, so whatever the rebuttal.
Yeah, yes. They can be used for whatever.
3 minutes.
3 minutes. So the biggest thing is, yes, in terms of affordable housing and funding for affordable housing, there's a lot that we can do on the state level. However, one of the things that I had a question, she can't respond, right? So we had a chance to spend funding that ended up might be going to the stadiums instead of affordable housing in itself. Very curious in terms of your thoughts on that. At the White Center Forum, you had mentioned that you would have, I don't want to misquote, you supported that. So
that is misquoted.
Exactly, yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So there is a video of it, so I would be very curious to see what that would be to say. So in terms of that then, how do we then, when we have the opportunity to put money towards affordable housing, make sure that it goes towards affordable housing versus corporate welfare for billionaires? In terms of the homelessness issue, fantastic response. Honestly, that's fantastic because it really is in terms of finding the root cause of what it is. It's cheaper to keep people housed than it is to get them out of homelessness, which is a fantastic way to make sure that we're spending our money effectively. And also making sure that we provide the human services necessary to take care of the folks in our community as well. Yeah, just want to say thank you. Fantastic on the very first question. So, yeah.
Are we done with the first question?
I don't know.
That's the first question.
That's the first question. Yes. Yeah.
That was one hell of a question.
That was like 8 questions in one.
So the second question involves schools, guns, and public safety. America has seen an epidemic of school shootings, and Washington is no exception, with a rate of school shootings that is 2.2 times the national average. The rate of law enforcement officers murdered with guns is 27% higher in Washington than the national average. Since 2008, firearm deaths have outnumbered motor vehicle deaths here. There are more licensed gun dealers in Washington state than post offices and Starbucks combined. 36% of Washington households have at least one firearm. 18% have an unlocked firearm and 12% have a loaded firearm. 7% have a loaded, unlocked firearm. Our kids go to school in the morning with the thought in the back of their minds that they may never come home, with unknown impacts on their ability to focus and learn. So the question is, what specific legislation will you introduce or co-sponsor to address gun violence in our state? And what is your plan to build support for your proposal in that legislature? Shannon, you get to go first on this one.
Okay, thank you.
6 minutes.
Thank you. Probably some of you who have heard me speak before have heard me talk about the fact that this last year, my now freshman in high school son came home, and as we were eating dinner and I asked what the interesting thing was he did in school that day, the interesting thing was he figured out where to hide and how to escape if an active shooter came to the school. That made me angry. Because our kids and our teachers should not be worrying about that. our kids and our teachers should be worrying about creating good learning environments, figuring out how to engage socially, all of the other great things that happen in a school. So it's absolutely causing a great deal of anxiety. And I support Initiative 1639, which we endorsed this evening. And frankly, the state legislature has failed us here. They have failed us. The kids who have walked out of their schools are the ones who have led the movement on behalf of the adults. And it's not just, we talk about the mass shootings in the schools, but that's not really what gun violence is about. It's a public health crisis. Gun violence is a public health crisis. It's a huge public health crisis within many of our communities where there is gang violence, and it's been a huge public health crisis for a long time that we have not effectively addressed at the federal or the state levels. It is a crisis around for protecting women and families who are victims of domestic violence. We have not done a good enough job of stepping up to put things in place that will protect families when they're in those situations. And then another one that's close to my heart is how behavioral and mental health is impacted when guns can be used as a way for a person to address their depression. I lost a good family friend to suicide when she was 15 years old. There was a gun in her house. And so her cry for help resulted in her death. That's unacceptable. We have absolutely got to provide mental health opportunities, frankly, for our young people. David Johnson of Navos talks about the fact that for every dollar you invest in mental health for infants and children who have experienced any kind of trauma, you save $17 in services in the end. So if people aren't compelled by the fact that guns do indeed kill people, I hope they're compelled by the fact that we have an economic advantage if we address some of these issues so that we are not finding ourselves in these positions. So I absolutely think that we need to support all of the components of 1639. We talked about the fact that guns killed more people than car accidents did, and that's because we require seatbelts in cars. It's a law. We enforce that law. We need to have safe storage for guns. It should be a law, and it should be enforceable, and we should make sure we're addressing that issue. So there are many components related to banning automatic weapons. I would support banning automatic weapons. I certainly support in 1639 raising the age of purchase to 21. I am very passionate about the fact that the Second Amendment is not an excuse for us to not create good public policy, to protect our communities and to protect our children. So I just want to be certain that whatever work we are doing, that is the goal in mind at the end. It is not about taking away people's guns any more than seatbelts were about taking away people's cars. And so I want to be certain that that is the kind of conversation we're having in the legislature. Because I think what you'll find is, unfortunately, as incredibly fabulous as this very, very liberal progressive district is, in the Washington State Legislature, the 49 senators, the 98 House members, they are not all this progressive. They are not all this liberal. They require motivation, different kinds of motivation to get to the end goal of our progressive values. And so we need to introduce what that motivation is. We need to talk about gun violence as a public health issue. We need to talk about steps that can be taken to address that public health issue. We need to talk about the way it impacts different people's families, the way it has impacted many of our communities for many years, and that we have failed, and it is time for us to step up. We should absolutely, if it takes our kids march into Olympia, I will happily give carpool rides to any children that need them. Because it is, again, I just can't stress enough, this is one of those issues that I am excited to be a leader on in the legislature. I would stand on the floor of the Senate. First thing, if Initiative 1639 does pass, then we need to start implementation, right? It's not just passing the initiative, it's all the work that's required to make sure that we can follow through on it, that we have the administrative means to do it. I will work on that if the initiative passes. I have been sole endorsed by the Alliance for Gun Responsibility. I am a Moms Demand Action candidate. I will stand up, I will implement that initiative, and if that initiative doesn't pass, I will introduce legislation to address every single piece of it. Because there's no
3 minutes to read a rebuttal on her response.
Yeah. Part of the gun epidemic, like we discussed, is due to suicide. About 900 people died last year in Washington State due to suicide by guns. Last year, my cousin, who I grew up with, who was a veteran himself, did decide that was his method for alleviating his depression as well. So I think there are a lot of emotions around about the gun issue, for and against, obviously, but to me, this is obviously very personal as well, just because it affected somebody that I grew up with, that I knew very well, and it affects our kids. My kids will be going through the public school systems very soon, going through the same training that yours had to go through as well, and I don't believe that as a society, something that we should be dealing with here in Washington State and here in the nation as well, especially with what's going on right now. Specifically with the legislation that we needed to talk about, obviously 1639 is something that we support here as a 34th, and here's something that I will support as well. So banning automatic weapons, making sure that we certainly don't need military weapons to go hunting, so that's a moot point in terms of your Second Amendments. Raising the age limit to purchasing a gun, which is part of 1639 as well. So when you have that much power in your hands, you should have also the capacity to take care of it. So make sure that we have training for folks who do choose to go that route, which is fine. I'm not necessarily against guns if it's for hunting and for your recreational purposes, but you should at the very least be clear in terms of how you're going to use that. Requiring insurance and being held accountable for the actions of your guns are some of the legislative pieces that we should think about as well. Make sure that we implement, and obviously safe storage is something that you've talked about. What's interesting is my father-in-law is actually a former Navy SEAL, so he has a huge safe full of guns, and it's interesting because we don't actually agree on a lot of things. He's very conservative and I'm not, so we have very good conversations in terms of various issues. Thanksgiving is always fun when we go out there. But one thing that we do actually agree on, and I'm going to preface this, he actually is an NRA member, but one thing that we agree on is actually the need for more gun safety and the need to make sure that we have the proper training and the protocols for folks who do choose to go that route. So it's so frustrating to see as a society us not acting on these specific issues, because people are literally dying right now, and it's totally preventable. Just as preventable as what we said earlier about car safety issues as well. So for me, wanted to make sure that we have the support for, obviously, the larger pieces of death when it comes to guns is mental health and depression and suicide, but also making sure that if folks choose to go that route, that we require training, we require insurance, so that they are held accountable for their actions as well.
Now, you still have 7 minutes to address more of the question, like the legislative piece.
Oh.
Yeah, that was supposed to be your rebuttal.
Oh,
yes.
I'm so sorry.
Well, yeah. you still can.
Okay. Sorry. I just was getting in my head.
It's a very strange format.
So for the legislative piece, we certainly needed to be champions for this as well. So Senate Bill 6620 last year, basically the form of the initiative to the state legislature did not pass. That's also one of those things where I believe that when you have representation in your legislative bodies, this should not be something controversial. We can't pass this as a society. Making sure that that the folks who are in our legislative leaders understand the value and understand the benefit of making sure that we don't have additional gun deaths in Washington State. One of the key things actually is a funding mechanism. So we talk a lot about progressive funding for all of our programs. One of the things that I would propose is charging a $25 fee or some sort of fee on gun purchases that would then go towards funding programs that can actually help with everything from training to making sure that people who do choose to go that route understand how to use it, but also prevention as well. So part of that could then be going to our schools, unfortunately, so that they can actually have the proper protocols to prevent against gun action. And then I know that this is federally not allowed, but even creating a registry and making sure that we at the very least track the guns that we have available. There's a whole host of issues associated with that, but one of the things is making sure that as we implement these, the piece of legislation to control gun violence and guns, that we're making sure that we also have the funding mechanism to make it happen at the same time as well. Sorry, I said most of my legislative stuff before in the previous ones, but just to reiterate, banning automatic weapons, raising the age limit to purchase guns, requiring insurance to own guns, requiring safe storage so people are accountable, and then making sure that if people do choose to buy semi-automatic weapons, there's a fee associated with that, and honestly guns in general, so that we can actually have the funding to implement and also to go towards resources to prevent gun deaths. Again, one of the biggest things is making sure that suicide prevention. Mass shootings obviously are horrific, but they're actually a small fraction of gun deaths in the nation. So addressing everything from accidental guns by having a safe storage and also mental health is important.
Now, did you have any cross-examination? You still have a few minutes.
Oh, yeah. So on the cross-examinations, I think we actually, we basically align on this issue, so there's not too much that's going to be different. What I am curious about is, have you ever talked to anybody who obviously would disagree, which I'm sure you have, and why do you think they are so adamant about not preventing gun deaths?
You have 3 minutes.
Thank you. Yes, I too have relatives, so I have certainly had conversations with people who feel that the Second Amendment, they are driven by fear. They are driven by fear that government is going to step up and interfere with what they see as a basic human right to own their gun. Now, when I have these conversations, what I say is, I am not a gun owner myself. I don't want a gun in my house. That is my druthers. But I also don't live in a rural community. I don't live on a farm. I don't live in Alaska where there are bears, right? There are different reasons that different people own guns. And so for the people that I've talked with, when you talk about it from a safety issue, you can usually start to make some progress individually and in one-on-one conversations with people. I think what we have definitely seen is the influence of the NRA, and especially at the federal level, and then it sinks down into the state level. That's the influence we're seeing is fear-mongering. And they are creating stories and highlighting things to convince people that they will no longer be safe if they do not have their gun. And so I think, again, talking about this issue from a public health approach, that it is a public health crisis. It is not trying to control people's guns. It's trying to keep people safe the same way we keep people safe with vaccines, the same way we keep people safe with any number of other public health information and regulation issues. So when I've had those one-on-one conversations, they can usually go pretty well at the end, but I think where we get into the trouble is where you start having the masses of people who are afraid based on NRA propaganda.
You have 4 minutes of rebuttal. Joe?
Yeah, I mean, we're both saying a lot of the same things. A lot of it actually, I think it's a cultural issue in terms of not necessarily just rural and urban, but also people's relationships with it as well. I mean, after one of the mass shootings, I actually went to a shooting range to talk to the people that were there, to the owners of the shooting range, just to get a feel for how can you be a person that would oppose common sense gun legislation when you've just seen kids die. And yes, it is a lot of it propaganda. I think a lot of it is a gun feels very empowering to some folks, where they may have only that as their source of feeling power. So for a lot of it is making sure that we understand where people are coming from, so that we can then convince and also understand how we can craft legislation and have a message that will then resonate with folks as well. But again, I'm also a Moms Who Ban Action candidate distinction as well, and wanted to make sure that our kids stay safe, wanted to make sure that our veterans have options besides suicide, wanted to make sure that we take care of our communities and don't have to have gun drills. So thank you so much. This is obviously a very important issue that we both care very much about. So thank you.
So I want to backtrack a little bit about on the legislative end for both of you. And as you made the point that the bubble, if you will, that we live in here is not the same as what exists in Olympia. For both of you, what specifically are your efforts going to be to bring them along, that is the more ardent gun supporter or resistor to that change? What's going to be your legislative action, your negotiating, if you will, to bring them along to better gun safety and control measures? So I'm going to have, well, you can go first. We'll give you 3 minutes. Go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, so a lot of the conversations that I've had with actual gun owners and folks who won't necessarily support has actually been training. We've gotten a lot of common ground where we all agree that if you're going to drive a car, you should know how to drive it. If you're going to use a gun, you should know how to use it. So part of the mechanism for, say, legislating a fee in terms of gun purchases, especially semi-automatic weapons, is actually being able to partner with, say, all these gun shops to provide training for new users as well. So I think there is common ground for folks who don't necessarily have the same views as we do in terms of guns, but I think we can start there and say at the very least, everybody should know how to use their gun appropriately so we don't have accidental discharges and everybody has a safe environment for it. So the key piece that I would probably harp on is training. I would use the funding mechanism by charging a fee on guns to have a pool of money for it. I would partner with gun shops so that they can provide that training as well. So that way, look, if you're going to have it, at the very least you should know how to use it as well. So that's kind of how it goes.
Just how does that transition to getting your peers on the other side of the aisle to buy into that?
I think they would buy into that. So I went and spoke with gun shop owners who is an interesting experience because I don't think we align on a lot of values, and we certainly honed in on the training piece. So if we focus on things where we have common ground, like making sure that folks have proper training, we can start there and show that we actually have more in common than we have that are not in common. So at the end of the day, our goal is to reduce gun deaths, and our goal is to make sure that folks who should not have access to guns should have access to guns. So if we can say, look, I think we all agree that training is important, that is a very good first step in terms of passing common sense gun legislation. So basically meeting them where I believe that they would be, and then kind of bringing them along that way.
Shannon, I'll give you 3 minutes.
First of all, of course, I certainly hope that Initiative 1639 passes, and then the message is very clear to all of our legislators about where the residents of this state want to go. Now, if it doesn't, while the legislature has failed to pass something, there have been people working diligently to try to get there with very specific legislation. One of them is Senator Frocht. He is a leader on this. He has been working with colleagues on the House side, on the Senate side, to try to move this legislation. So one of the first things I would do would be to reach out to him, find out from him who our issue people are, who the people are who are on the fence on both the House side and the Senate side, coordinate with the other allies, and frankly, you come up with a plan, right? So you figure out who are the trusted advisors for the people who are still sitting on the fence. How do you reach out to those people? Not me from my 34th bubble necessarily every time, but how do we reach out to a gun shop owner who can go to a particular senator or go to a particular House member and say, no, I support this legislation. Here's why I support it. And you continue to do that with other stakeholders, and if you can get unexpected stakeholders to step up in that way, that's where you really start to find success. When you have a group of people showing up at a senator's office who live in their district, who are gun owners or members at a gun range, and you have convinced them and demonstrated to them why it's important, that's when you start shifting those minds. And then, amongst the colleagues, that's where you really start doing the work, to start saying, this is my priority piece of legislation. I will be hammering this every single day. I will drive you crazy. And sometimes it works, right? And you keep driving at it that way. And frankly, you have a plan in place. And the people who are leading on it have, my suggestion would be, hey, we're leading on this. Who are the people we need to influence? Let's make a list of those of us who are going to be in charge of gathering those votes, right? Make me the point person to get these 3 votes. And I will go and I will do the work to get those votes in collaboration with other allies. But make it my responsibility, make me accountable for it, build a team that is doing that work at the Senate, and that, I think, is how you can move that kind of legislation.
Before we before we end, I feel like I'm almost obligated to ask, what do you advocate for specifically concerning the 34th? What's your highest priority that you advocate for us down in Olympia? I'll give you 2 minutes each.
Okay. All right. I always struggle with highest priority because there are so many. But on behalf of the 34th, as we discussed earlier, so many of these issues tie back to our incredibly regressive tax system. So a highest priority for me is taking steps to address our regressive tax system, passing a capital gains tax, thank you so much, passing a capital gains tax, and addressing the corporate tax breaks to be certain that we are indeed getting public benefit out of those, requiring the demonstration of that, and frankly, just closing the ones that we know and that other people have done the work on to say, these are some where we could really get some revenue. So I think addressing that system is super important. And then the other priority issue for me is probably, we need to protect our access to our healthcare. Our state has done actually a very good job of building out our Medicaid expansion. So I will talk about something that's really important to me is addressing childcare access. As a single working mom, as somebody who went to school while also being a parent, I know how challenging it is, and I had a lot of support around me. So for a lot of people, that is not an opportunity. And if we want to talk about equal access to opportunity, if we want to talk about closing the gender pay gap, if we want to talk about those things, access to childcare is really important. But it falls in line with access, it's all a part of having access to healthcare, access to education. It's hard to pick the one priority because to me what the priority is making sure all of the people in this state, frankly, and in this district have the opportunities to create a life that they can thrive in. That is really what the end goal is. We need to pull down the barriers that make people not have those opportunities. Some of those are related to healthcare, some of those are related to education, and some of those are related to things like childcare.
Again, thank you so much for the time. Yes, we need to address our regressive tax structure, but the end goal is making sure that this economy and that this Washington state works for all families, regardless of where you're from. We unequivocally stand with working families because that is my background as a person who worked as a janitor at his high school. That is a person that has worked in retail, that is a person that has worked multiple jobs just to help our family thrive. So the issues and things that I care about is making sure that we have an equitable environment for everybody to live. And that means that we stand for our workers, that means that we stand for a minimum wage that is appropriate, that means that we stand for paid family leave, that means that we have an equitable tax structure that is fair for everybody else. What that also means is that if we're a champion for the causes of working class people, and we say that we're for minimum wage, we're the only candidate that doesn't take corporate PAC money, because I don't want anybody to have any ambiguity in terms of where my passions and where my interests are. So, I have nothing against businesses by any means, but obviously part of that is fixing our regressive tax structure, our exemptions, and also making sure that we are beholden to only this community, and that we only the only special interests that we care about are the folks that are in this room, and the folks that are in this district, and the working class families that are in Washington State. So, thank you, Chris, for hosting. Thank you, everybody, for coming. It's standing room only. This is fantastic.
We were really going to do closing.
Okay. There you go.
So I'll give you both a minute for closing statements.
Yes.
Go start your story.
Holding the neck. Yeah. Thank you. First off, thank you for coming. Part of having a robust democracy is people that show up, and you being here means the world to both of us, to be honest, because that's why we fight every single day, and that's why we go out, and that's why we door knock. Even right now, I have 3 people out door knocking around the community. The way that we make sure that we show up for the community is that we actually show up, right? So we've door knocked about 15,000 doors so far. We're still going, and a lot of the passion that we see at the doors drives why we're out here right now. For folks who don't know, my parents are refugees from Vietnam. I was born and raised. When I was a kid, my father was in a car accident, right? So this community came to my support when we needed it the most. This is why we fight so hard, and this is why I care. This is why we're running, is because the people here aren't just constituents or voters. These are my family and friends that I've known my entire life, and I will fight for you because you are my family and friends. Thank you so much.
Yes, again, thank you so much for being here. It is really an amazing opportunity to be able to run for this state Senate seat. And I think we're fortunate that we actually have candidates in front of you that are not the normal representation we see in our elected bodies. I am a single working mom who has school-aged kids. It's really hard to be able to get into this kind of system when you are in that position, right? And I'm going to address the issue of corporate PAC money, because I'm also somebody, that's not just a line that I'm a single working mom, it's real. I can't self-finance. I support campaign reform, I always have. I voted and endorsed honest elections in 2015. My opponent didn't even vote in that election. I stand up for working families. I have been endorsed by every labor union that has endorsed in this race because they know I stand up for working families. And I will stand up for the people in the 34th district. And I will constantly support and advocate for campaign finance reform. So, thank you all very much, and we really look forward to more of this 55 days.
Round of